Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. As always, I'm your host, Ben Thomas. Today we're digging into houses of worship and how network connectivity has actually completely changed some of the ways that houses of worship are using streaming technology, signal distribution technology, signal for their audio systems and to their PAs, and video distribution in so many different ways. So I wanted to bring on somebody today who's a lot smarter than I am, and that's Mark Hanna from the Sony Faith team over at Sony. Mark, thanks so much for joining us today.
I appreciate you having me.
You know, Mark, you're one of the newer team members over at the Sony team, so would love to hear a little bit about your story and how you kind of landed there before we dig in. So if you would, just give us a quick overview. How'd you end up landing and running the House of Worship vertical over at Sony?
Sheer luck. Honestly, I knew my predecessor a little bit from, I used to write for a magazine, and I had interviewed him for the magazine multiple times, and so we had a lot of common friends on that side of the house. And when Craig Harper's my predecessor, when he decided he wanted to retire, he went looking for someone to succeed him in this role, and started talking to his network of people and was like, who do you know, who do you know, who do you know? And fortunately, my name got thrown out, and he and I had many conversations between him getting my name and me actually applying for the job. Was probably a 6-month period, but we had, 20 hours of conversations in that 6-month period, just going over what the job looked like, what the, if it was going to happen, what this would mean, what the vertical was, what do you know about the faith market, that type of thing. And being a tech director myself, this is one of those that it's like, this is a dream job, right? Come on, I get to go work with churches and hear about what they're doing and hear their stories and talk with tech directors. And I mean, come on, it's perfect.
So Mark, obviously network connectivity has totally impacted how we really create services these days, right? Yeah. You look at a lot of legacy systems, you look to, SDI cables, maybe a little bit of fiber, probably 10, 15 years ago. Obviously fiber's still very viable, sure, right? But a little bit more enterprise. But especially when you look at that small to medium-sized church, the network connectivity and protocols like NDI, even some Dante, things like that, are such a critical part of their workflows. What are some of the ways that you've seen that evolve?
In my time, obviously Dante coming into its own. I was tech director 15 years ago. It's been a while. But, Dante had just come into its own when I was leaving. And so that's seeing that come into more of, mainstream, as it were. Like I said, it's getting to the point now where if you're not a network administrator, you can't be an audio engineer because you have to know how the network is set up and how to patch it and things like that to be able to work stuff like Dante.
Well, wanted to ask a question too, kind of in that same note, right? The IP side of the world historically has not been something that the creative team, and I'll even say the media director folks, it depends on where your media director lives, or your tech director, have typically skewed a little bit more creative and not as much on the infrastructure side, which requires the IT teams, the network security teams to have direct collaboration and correlation. What are some of the ways that you've seen tech directors in that IT world kind of come together?
It's interesting to me. It used to be you would see guys, tech directors at churches would come in having some knowledge of audio or something like that. They'd have a background in some type of production. It's becoming far more common now for me to see the IT guy take over the tech department. So you have a guy who's trained in IT. This is what he knows, networks and network security and that type of thing. And now he's responsible for audio, video, lighting, and all that type of stuff because it's getting to the point that all of those need that. And so while I think that was less common, when I was originally getting in there into churches, it's becoming far more common now and becoming almost a requirement, is that you have somebody on the team who's not just IT savvy, but like IT really savvy.
Well, I agree. And one of the places, ironically enough, well, at least for myself, I look to see what technologies are coming in the future is houses of worship, right? Mm-hmm. Because they found a really good way to scale technology. They found a great way to leverage existing technologies to maybe grow in the future. But one of the challenges that comes with innovation is that, there is this adoption curve, right? But sometimes the incumbent is still necessary, right? This is one of the questions I get all the time, and I'm going to kick this to you because it's a hard question to answer. Sorry for putting you on the spot. But let's talk traditional SDI fiber workflows versus network, right? I think it's flashy and trendy, albeit effective, to try and go to a full network-based workflow. But what are some of the differences and some of the advantages versus maybe a traditional SDI fiber type system versus a network-based system?
They're easy to get up and running, right? I mean, rather than having to run SDI, if you had a building spec, there's a good chance you have a network system in the building, right? Running to server rooms and offices and things like that. So it's entirely possible that you already have a system ready to go in place just because, you know, you have a computer that needs to be somewhere. Whereas with SDI and some of the latent and older products, if you don't have something there, you get to pull cable. And depending on how your building was built, that could be a really interesting process.
Well, look, now I've got to ask the inverse question. And this is, I tend to skew more, especially for medium to larger churches, using SDI and things like that and sprinkling in network as needed. But that's my opinion. You know, on your side of the world, what's a lot of the value that you see with the traditional infrastructure systems like the SDIs? Well,
they're bulletproof. I mean, it's set and forget. You know, it's just bulletproof. That's all I can think to say about it. Is once it's in, unless you've broken a cable or something, it just works. We were talking earlier. It's one of those, and it's easy to fix in the event that something has broken. You know, I've had to terminate cables during prayer before. And being able to terminate an SDI cable during a prayer is one thing. Being able to terminate a network cable, it might take a little more. It would take me a little bit longer. I can do an SDI
got those
cable.
Individual,
that's right.
Yeah.
I can do an SDI cable like that. Network cable is going to take me a little bit. So, you know, just having that flexibility and that end user, you know, being able to handle things is huge. Network cables, if you have an IT guy, chances are good they know how to terminate network cables, you know, but yeah, you know, so it's just more complicated. That said, you know, it is easier in the fact that, you know, what does network cable cost per foot versus SDI cost per foot, right? Network cable is pennies on the foot versus SDI is probably closer to dollars on the foot. So being able to have that lower initial cost of developing the infrastructure versus, you know, an SDI infrastructure where it's going to cost you a little bit more to get the cable there. Just the proliferation of being able to get network cables, I mean, they're just easy to get places, right? I've run them in my own house, right? From rooms to rooms just so that because I had a dead Wi-Fi zone in the house. Okay, well, we'll run a cable to that spot, no problem. If I were trying to run an SDI or something else, like why? Right. Why would I ever do that? Right. I don't need that. But network cable is just there, right? And so being able to take advantage of an infrastructure that may already be in place that wasn't necessarily designed for this, but will work for this, I think is huge.
Well, look, what's interesting in any conversation about house of worship, I feel like this is important to bring up, is the volunteer workforce, right? You talk about SDI and a lot of those systems being more bulletproof, very predictable. That makes being a volunteer easier. As much as we like to train our volunteer base and things like that, there's a lot more variability with network connection, right? You change an IP address, you bring down an entire show.
Correct.
Right? And I don't, it's obviously kind of a joke, but kind of not.
It's kind of not, no.
And that's what's interesting. And I think that we battle from time to time is, okay, how do we find that sweet spot of adapting new technology, leveraging existing technology, finding budgetary things that make sense, but also having that backbone for our volunteers? Because if you put a volunteer in a situation that they're really uncomfortable in, you're going to have probably a hard time retaining that volunteer in the long term. But the more you set them up for success, they're going to continue to grow. Talk about, in your experience, kind of some of that, those maybe challenges that you've run into with volunteers, specifically on maybe some of the troubleshooting side, and especially with some of those systems that are a little bit less predictable.
We don't have time for the stories that I can tell you about volunteers having trouble troubleshooting. And this is one of those, I think the church world has kind of gotten this a little bit more right on the, you know, having staff people who are responsible for building, maintaining, care, and feeding of systems, but then setting those systems up in a way that it is easy for a volunteer to come in and succeed, because it's reliable, it's repeatable, it's easy to just, you know, we've set this in place, and you have one person who's done all the hard work to get it to a point that a volunteer can just come in and do just what they need to do. And, you know, I have volunteers that I had trained to run switcher for our service, have no idea how to program a switcher, would have no idea how to go in and change something if something if they had to reroute a cable or reroute a connector or something like that, they would have no idea how to even make those changes on the switcher. We're not making those changes every weekend, so it's not a problem. So they're set up to succeed in that. I need you to sit here, and here's the buttons you need to know. And yes, there's this whole section of the switcher over here. Don't touch this. Just don't touch this, ever. for the same reason, because as with IT networks, because you can push one button and, okay, now everything is different, and it's wrong, and it's going to be hard to recover. But as long as you don't push that button, everything's fine, and it's repeatable, and you're in a position to succeed. So I think the church world in particular has done a good job of setting aside and building those processes and procedures so that you have someone usually on staff who does the heavy lifting and is the rising tide that raises all the ships of the volunteers who can just come in and execute.
Yeah. Well, last question, and we talked a little bit about this before we went live here. One of the benefits, but probably the biggest challenge of network-based workflows is security, right? Largely problems that you sort of a little bit run into with traditional workflows, but those for the most part are closed ecosystems, right? It's very difficult unless I patch into your rack for me to jump in